Well, following the developments in South Sudan, I'm now joined by Rajab Mohandis, who's a civil society delegate to South Sudan Peace Talks, also a member of the South Sudan Civil Society Forum. Thank you so much for making time.
You're welcome.
Well, we hear you are actively participating in the talks, the peace talks in South Sudan. Perhaps a preamble before we get into the nitty-gritty details.
Okay, thank you. These peace negotiations, referred to as the High-Level Revitalization Forum, came as a result of failure to fully implement the 2015 peace agreement that was signed in Ethiopia. And so IGAD, as the grantor, main grantor and lead negotiator of the peace agreement, resolved that the parties should convene and again revitalize the agreement. And so in the past 8.5 months, we have been involved in the negotiations. We had about 13 different opposition groups and the transitional government of national unity, the incumbent transitional government, and also civil society groups involving the church and religious leaders, civil society, women groups, youth, business community. So there was a diverse group of all stakeholders involved in the negotiations. This started on the 17th of December in Addis Ababa, and by the end of June it was moved to Khartoum. So on the 12th, Wednesday, last week, the final agreement was signed in Addis Ababa between the government and the different opposition groups.
Well, needless to say, this is not the first peace agreement that has been signed between the rebel groups and President Salva Kiir. What are your expectations about this present deal, bearing in mind that there seems to be an altercation already between the forces in this particular peace deal?
Well, as a member of the peace negotiations representing the civil society, first of all, the civil population generally, kind of a bit reserved and skeptical about the whole thing. But people expect that this agreement should be implemented anyway. And generally, the South Sudanese back home in the country and in the region demand that there should actually be peace. They have been supportive of the peace negotiations. And so as a member of the civil society, I'm quite hopeful that the parties will honor their commitments and that the regional body, IGAD, will also be strongly following up with them to ensure that the agreement is implemented.
Speaking of honoring commitments, South Sudan main rebel force SPLM-IO has accused the government forces of attacking their defensive positions a day after they signed the deal. Does this show that this peace sign is doomed, perhaps?
Well, this is quite disappointing because they signed the cessation of hostilities agreement in December, on the 21st of December last year. And since then, there have been skirmishes, mainly involving government forces and forces loyal to the main opposition group, the SPLM in opposition. And with the signing of this agreement, we expected that, honestly, they would end these confrontations. However, we still hear of the confrontations, especially in areas like Ye. And it's a point of concern to us as citizens of South Sudan. And in that regard, we expect that the parties will reach out to their forces to be able to explain to them that an agreement has been signed and they have a responsibility to implement this agreement, particularly ceasing hostilities.
Well, implementation of this peace deal is basically the backbone of South Sudan rising from years of internal conflicts to actually, gain more economic opportunities and whatsoever. But let's talk about the nitty-gritties of the peace deal. We know there's a raft of issues that need to be addressed, the security priorities and also the political priorities. Let's start with the political priorities. We've seen various positions set up to actually include various rebel factions in the government. Will this have a bad resolve in the end goal, long-term effects of this particular peace deal?
Well, I think one thing that is important in this regard is getting the different stakeholders, the different parties, to work together to be able to implement the peace agreement. And the agreement has provided, the peace process provided that opportunity to bring the different groups together. And we hope that by bringing them to the table and to be in the government, that will reduce the chances of spoiling the implementation of the agreement and pursuing objectives by violent means. And so getting these parties to the agreement is a positive development in a way, so that they will pursue their political interests in a peaceful way instead of resorting to violence that causes destruction to our country.
Speaking of resorting to violence, the security priorities in this particular deal, we have various armed groups within South Sudan. Talk about the National Army, we talk about the rebel groups that are well armed. How do you actually cater this in the peace agreement, or how did you cater this in the peace agreement?
Well, initially when they negotiated in Addis before moving to Khartoum, there was a provision for 3 months of pre-interim or pre-transitional period before the main transitional period begins. And there were suggestions that this period would be used to reorganize the army to improve on security. However, in the final agreement, the pre-transitional period has been extended to 8 months. And within these 8 months, the main task will be reorganizing the security forces, cantoning these forces, and then training them and unifying them and then deploying them to take charge of security. So this arrangement is meant to be able to cater for these various forces that are in the country and that could potentially actually affect implementation.
Okay, as we finish or conclude this particular interview, President Salva Kiir has earlier on in other peace agreements actually blamed their collapse on foreign influence or interference. Perhaps as a member of the civil society, and perhaps illustrate the point that the foreign influence will not be a factor in this particular peace deal, while also highlighting the importance of IGAD as a regional body to actually foster peace in South Sudan.
Well, the agreement that was not fully implemented, that was signed in 2015, Article 1.1 of that agreement says there shall be established in South Sudan a transitional government of national unity, tasked with the responsibility to implement the agreement. This agreement that was signed last Wednesday also says the same thing. So the primary responsibility of success of implementation or failure lies with the transitional government of national unity and those in charge of the transitional government of national unity. So the other parties provide support, but actually the primary responsibility lies with the parties. And so in this regard, for IGAD, their role is to support the implementation and bring consequences on parties that will violate the provisions of this agreement.
The importance of this peace deal to neighboring countries that border South Sudan. We've seen the economic crisis, not just in South Sudan, but Sudan as a country as well, who actually rely on crude oil for major of their economy. We also have the debate on so many people who are unsettled from South Sudan going to neighboring countries to seek asylum and whatnot. Is this an issue that IGAD will definitely seek to address, even as this interim government tries to bring in normalcy in South Sudan?
Yes, exactly. Actually, Chapter 3 of the agreement talks about humanitarian issues, and particularly issues of repatriation of South Sudanese who are in different neighboring countries. And it's a point of concern to the IGAD region, but also the South Sudanese citizens who are in some of these countries feel that they want to go back home. And this agreement is important, that if it's fully implemented, it will create the environment necessary for South Sudanese to get back home, but also reduce not only the issues of refugees, but also issues of security with fighting in South Sudan and various militia groups with arms there is also the potential for weapons to cross over to cross borders to the neighboring countries. And so the agreement is important in a way that it will be able to address some of these things if it's fully implemented.
Well, thank you so much, Rajab Mohandis, who's a member of the civil society delegate to South Sudan peace talks, as well as a member of the South Sudan Civil Society Forum. Pleasure having you on Bottom Line Africa, especially as we get to look at the youngest nation in the world and the peace talks that seem to be cemented